The chilling enigma of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, a name whispered in hushed tones among enthusiasts of the unexplained, continues to captivate and confound. In the desolate northern Ural Mountains, 9 experienced Soviet ski hikers perished under circumstances so bizarre they have defied conventional explanation for over 6 decades. On February 1st or 2nd, 1959, the group, led by Igor Dyatlov, abandoned their tent on Kholat Syakhl, a place known ominously as Dead Mountain, in sub-zero temperatures, many without adequate clothing or footwear. Their bodies, discovered weeks and months later, presented a horrifying tableau of hypothermia, alongside inexplicable blunt force trauma, missing body parts, and even traces of radiation. The initial Soviet investigation concluded with a vague, compelling natural force, sealing the case and igniting a firestorm of speculation that persists to this very day. This video embarks on a meticulous, balanced investigation into the facts surrounding the Dyatlov Pass Incident. It integrates the crucial historical context of the Soviet era, systematically addresses every strange phenomenon reported, and explores the myriad of theories, from the scientifically plausible to the truly paranormal, that attempt to unravel this enduring mystery. The ill-fated expedition was composed of 9 experienced ski hikers, primarily students or recent graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, an engineering student after whom the pass was later named. The group consisted of 8 men and 2 women, all seasoned in long ski tours and mountain expeditions, making their eventual demise particularly perplexing. Their ambitious goal was a 14-day Category 3 trek to Mount Otterton, a challenging route classified as the most difficult for that season, with expected temperatures plummeting as low as -30 degrees Celsius. The journey began with the group arriving by train in Ivdel on January 25, 1959, followed by a truck ride to Vizay, the northernmost inhabited settlement. Their trek towards Gora Otterton commenced on January 27th. Diaries and cameras recovered from their final campsite allowed investigators to meticulously trace their route up to the day preceding the incident. A pivotal moment occurred on January 28th when Yuri Yudin, a 21-year-old member, was compelled to turn back due to debilitating knee and joint pain exacerbated by sciatica. Yudin's early departure, initially a personal setback, would prove to be a chilling example of fate's arbitrary hand, as he was the sole survivor of the expedition. His survival underscores the extreme and sudden nature of the tragedy that befell the remaining 9, suggesting that the event was not a targeted attack on the entire group, but rather a sudden, overwhelming force that left no time for escape or strategic thinking for those who remained. Before his departure, Dyatlov had mentioned to Yudin that the expedition might take longer than the initially planned February 12th return date. On February 1st, the group, disoriented by a blizzard, deviated west towards the top of Kholat Syakhl, or Mountain 1079, instead of crossing the pass. Despite realizing their error near nightfall, and being only 1.5 kilometers from a forested area that would have offered shelter, Dyatlov made the critical decision to camp on the open slope of Kholat Syakhl. This choice, seemingly minor at the time, became a fatal pivot point. It suggests either an underestimation of the immediate conditions or a strong strategic rationale, such as avoiding the loss of elevation gained or practicing mountain camping techniques that in hindsight proved catastrophic. This highlights the inherent unpredictability of extreme environments where even minor tactical decisions can have disproportionately severe consequences when combined with unforeseen natural phenomena. To protect themselves from the brutal wind, they dug a hollow approximately 4 feet into the snow and pitched their communal tent inside it. They had dinner around 6 or 7 in the evening, and it is presumed that Semyon and Nikolay went outside around this time, as they were later found to be better dressed than the others. The year 1959 unfolded during a period known as the Khrushchev thaw in the Soviet Union, characterized by a relaxation of repression and censorship following Nikita Khrushchev's de-Stalinization policy. This era saw a notable increase in cultural exchange, including international festivals, foreign films, uncensored books, and the significant American National Exhibition in Moscow that very year. The exhibition's latent goal was to display the United States' productivity and prosperity, subtly encouraging the Soviet Union to shift resources towards consumer goods and away from heavy industry, thereby reducing war material production. Premier Khrushchev himself embarked on a historic visit to the United States in September 1959, an event widely regarded as a promising step toward easing the intense Cold War tensions, despite underlying suspicions from both sides. However, despite the outward appearance of a thaw, relations between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States remained under intense strain, marked by periods of profound distrust and anxiety. Both nations, under the guidance of their respective governments, claimed to represent the aspiration of humanity while regarding the other as the devil's disciple. The ongoing Berlin crisis from 1958 to 1961 epitomized this geopolitical tension, with Soviet demands for Western powers to withdraw their forces from West Berlin. The divided city starkly highlighted the contrast between capitalist and communist systems, and the mass exodus from East to West Berlin presented a constant challenge for the Soviets. The subsequent downing of the American U-2 spy plane in 1960 further intensified these tensions, underscoring the pervasive espionage and military posturing of the era. In preparation for potential conflict, President Kennedy activated reservists and increased defense expenditures. The Soviet Union was simultaneously pursuing rapid advancements in its military capabilities, particularly in nuclear rocketry. The Strategic Rocket Forces were officially founded on December 17, 1959, serving as the main force for operating land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. This period witnessed the introduction of several intercontinental ballistic missiles into service, including the R-12 and RH-7. Test sites like Baikonur and Pleiades were crucial for these developments. A major disaster, the Nedlin catastrophe, occurred in October 1960 during an R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile test, killing the Strategic Rocket Forces commander and remaining concealed for decades. The Khrushchev thaw period, while suggesting openness, paradoxically created a climate where unusual incidents, especially those near sensitive military development areas, would be met with heightened secrecy and control by Soviet authorities. The apparent openness was superficial when national security or embarrassing failures were at stake. Any incident, particularly one involving unexplained deaths in a remote, strategically significant region like the Urals, where intercontinental ballistic missiles were deployed, would immediately trigger a cover-up reflex to maintain an image of control and strength, both internally and externally. This inherent tension between proclaimed openness and deep-seated state secrecy directly fueled the conspiracy theories surrounding Dyatlov Pass, as the swift closure and classification of the case, despite the thaw, was a predictable outcome of the Soviet system prioritizing image and control over transparency. The region traversed by the Dyatlov group was also home to the indigenous Mansi people, a semi-nomadic group living in the Tyumen and Sverdlovsk regions of Siberia. Their traditional livelihood centered on fishing, hunting, trapping, and some reindeer herding. They speak an Obo-Ugric language and traditionally lived in tribal structures with phratries and clans, each with ancestor cults and sacred sites. Their beliefs are nominally Orthodox Christian, but largely animistic, incorporating ancestor worship and the belief that each man possesses 5 souls. Under Soviet administration, many Mansi were settled on collective farms and new economic activities were introduced, altering their traditional way of life. Initial suspicions in the Dyatlov Pass investigation regrettably pointed to the Mansi, with accusations of them attacking the hikers for trespassing on sacred land. However, investigators found no evidence to support this theory. Neither Otorten nor Kholat Syakhl were considered sacred or taboo places by the Mansi, and no footprints other than the hikers were found at the scene. The immediate suspicion of the Mansi, despite their instrumental role in locating the remaining 4 bodies in May, points to a pre-existing prejudice or convenient scapegoating by Soviet authorities, rather than an objective assessment of evidence. This highlights how cultural context and power dynamics can distort investigations and narratives. The debunking of the Mansi theory is crucial for accuracy and for respecting the indigenous people's role and identity, shifting the focus back to the truly inexplicable aspects of the incident. The alarm was raised when the group failed to send a telegram from Visay by the expected date of February 12th. By February 20th, concerned loved ones initiated a rescue operation. The search party, which included student Mikhail Sharavin, eventually discovered the abandoned and badly damaged tent on Kholat Syakhl on February 26th. The state of the tent was baffling. It was partially covered in snow, collapsed, and found to be empty. Crucially, it had been slashed open from the inside, suggesting a desperate, hurried exit rather than a leisurely departure. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the cuts were indeed made from inside. Inside, the hikers' belongings, including their boots, warm clothes, equipment, and even food, some sliced on a plate, were found relatively undisturbed and neatly arranged. Just outside the tent, frozen footprints from 8 or 9 people were discovered, some wearing socks, a single boot, or even barefoot, leading downhill towards a nearby forest. These tracks continued for 5 to 10 meters before disappearing under snow. The footprints were described as consistent with individuals walking at a normal pace, not running in panic. This stark contrast between the undisturbed tent contents and the hikers' desperate flight, coupled with the varied states of dress and injuries, indicates a sudden, overwhelming and terrifying event that forced an immediate, irrational evacuation. The decision to cut their way out implies the normal exit was blocked or unusable, and the urgency overrode any logical survival instinct to grab essential gear. This central paradox, why experienced hikers would abandon their shelter and gear in such extreme conditions, is the core of the Dyatlov Pass mystery, driving nearly all subsequent theories. Several hundred yards or 1.5 kilometers northeast, away from the tent near the edge of a forest and a large Siberian pine, searchers found the remains of a small fire. Near this fire, the first 2 bodies were found, Yuri Doroshenko, 21, and Yuri Krivonychenko, 23. They were shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. Krivonychenko had burns on his body and a piece of flesh from his own hand in his mouth, suggesting he had bitten it off. The branches on the nearby cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters high, possibly indicating an attempt to climb it. Between the pine and the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered. Igor Dyatlov, 23, Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, and Rustem Slobodin, 23. They were found at distances of 300 meters, 480 meters, and 630 meters from the cedar respectively. Their poses suggest that they were attempting to return to the tent. All 5 initial bodies were relatively intact and uninjured, with medical examinations concluding hypothermia as the cause of death. Slobodin, however, had a small crack in his skull, though it was not initially considered fatal. It took 2 months for the remaining 4 bodies to be located, found on May 5th, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine, 70 to 75 meters deeper into the woods from the cedar tree. These 4 were Ludmila Dubinina, 20, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, Nikolai Tibraniolis, 23, and Alexander Kolovatov, 24. They were better dressed than the first 5, with evidence suggesting they had taken clothes from their deceased comrades for warmth. For example, Zolotarov wore Dubnina's faux fur coat and hat, and Dubnina had Krivonychenko's sweater. The delayed discovery of these 4 bodies, along with their more severe injuries and better clothing, suggest a secondary phase of the tragedy where survival efforts were made, and the initial event was distinct from the final cause of death for this subgroup. This implies a dynamic, unfolding tragedy rather than a single, instantaneous event. Unlike the first 5, these 4 had sustained severe traumatic injuries. Tibo Brinole had major skull damage, and Dubanina and Zolotaryov suffered severe chest trauma, including multiple broken ribs. Doctors compared the force required to cause such damage to that of a car crash, yet there were no external wounds on the bodies, suggesting immense pressure without outward signs of struggle or impact. Most gruesomely, Dubanina was found missing her tongue and the muscles on the floor of her mouth. Additionally, two bodies, Dubinina and Zolotaryov, were missing their eyes, and Dubinina was also missing eyebrows. The group had attempted to build a den in the snow, lining it with branches, suggesting a desperate effort to survive. The forensic analysis of the Dyatlov Pass victims revealed a perplexing array of injuries and conditions, contributing significantly to the enduring mystery. 6 of the 9 hikers ultimately died from hypothermia, consistent with prolonged exposure to the extreme cold. A phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing is a recognized aspect of severe hypothermia, where individuals experiencing confusion and disorientation inexplicably remove their clothing, feeling as if they are overheating despite freezing to death. This physiological response could explain why Doroshenko and Krivonechenko were found in their underwear. However, the deaths of 3 hikers were attributed to severe physical trauma. Nikolai Thibodeau-Brignoles sustained a fatal skull injury, while Ludmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov suffered severe chest trauma, including multiple broken ribs. Rustem Slobodin also had a small crack in his skull, though it was not initially considered a fatal wound. Medical examiners, notably Dr. Boris Vozhoshdeny, compared the force required to cause these injuries to that of a car crash. Yet, remarkably, there were no external wounds on the bodies, suggesting immense pressure without outward signs of struggle or impact. Some victims also presented with other bruises and abrasions, such as Dyatlov and Slobodin, who had bruises on their hands that some interpreted as consistent with hand-to-hand combat, though this particular observation remains debated. The combination of hypothermia as a cause of death for some and severe blunt force trauma for others, coupled with the absence of external wounds, points to a unique mechanism of injury that defies typical expectations for either natural exposure or human assault. This specific injury pattern is a crucial piece of the puzzle, forcing investigators and theorists to consider highly unusual natural phenomena or highly sophisticated concealed human actions. Perhaps the most gruesome finding was the condition of Ludmila Dubinina, who was found missing her tongue and the muscles on the floor of her mouth. Additionally, 2 bodies, Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov, were missing their eyes, and Dubinina was also missing her eyebrows. While initially contributing to the incident's bizarre nature, the loss of these soft tissues is now widely attributed to post-mortem animal scavenging. Dubinina's head, for instance, was partially submerged in running water in the creek, a condition that would accelerate decomposition and make tissue more accessible to scavengers. Another alarming discovery was the presence of traces of radiation on some of the hikers' clothing. This radioactivity was detected on only a few items and was below the sensitivity threshold of some devices for gamma radiation, but detectable for beta radiation. While initially fueling theories of secret weapons testing, a plausible explanation for this contamination is the Kishtim disaster, a major nuclear contamination accident that occurred on September 29, 1957, at the Mayak plutonium reprocessing plant in the southern Urals, just 2 years prior. The Kishtim disaster released an estimated 20 million curies of radioactive material, contaminating thousands of square kilometers and affecting over 270,000 people. Radioactive substances were known to be carried on clothes and vehicles and could have entered the food chain. The contamination was likely received before the trip, perhaps through work or contaminated food rather than from a direct incident at the pass. This recontextualizes one of the most weird pieces of evidence, from a direct cause to a background environmental factor, reducing its sensational impact while highlighting the hidden human cost of the Soviet nuclear arms race and its lax safety standards. Among the other unusual observations, Yuri Krivonchenko was found to have bitten off a portion of his hand. Some bodies also exhibited unusually darkened skin or a metallic-like tan, which could be attributed to prolonged exposure to the elements. The scraping of skin from the bark of nearby trees near the first two bodies suggests desperate attempts to climb or gain a vantage point. The initial Soviet investigation into the Dyatlov Pass Incident was launched immediately after the first 5 bodies were found. Despite the perplexing evidence, the investigation swiftly concluded within 3 months, stating that a compelling natural force had caused the deaths. The records were subsequently sealed, and the area was closed for 3 years, a decision that only served to heighten public suspicion and fuel a multitude of conspiracy theories. Over 6 decades later, Russia reopened the investigation in 2019. In July 2020, the Prosecutor General's office presented its conclusions, asserting that an avalanche had led to the deaths. The official report stated that survivors of the avalanche were forced to flee their camp in low visibility conditions with inadequate clothing and subsequently succumbed to hypothermia. Andrei Kuryakov, deputy head of the regional prosecutor's office, characterized the event as a heroic struggle with no panic, but ultimately no chance of survival under the circumstances. The investigation noted that the group split, with some attempting to return to the tent and others trying to build a shelter further down the slope. The severe fractures observed in the second group of bodies were attributed to the pressure of large amounts of snow, possibly from a secondary collapse while they were digging a snow den. An experiment was conducted to demonstrate the extreme difficulty of finding the tent in low visibility, supporting the idea that they were unable to return to retrieve their crucial gear. Further scientific support for the avalanche theory emerged from a 2021 study led by scientists from EPFL and ETH Zurich. This study provided a detailed physical model for a specific type of avalanche, a slab avalanche, attempting to reconcile many of the previously cited counter-arguments. The proposed mechanism involves a combination of critical factors. Firstly, the tent was strategically placed below a shoulder in a locally steeper slope. This was up to 30 degrees for wind protection. This specific configuration created a natural trap where wind-blown snow could accumulate directly above the tent. Secondly, the presence of a weak grainy depth hoar or sugar snow layer at the base of the snowpack, parallel to the locally steeper terrain, was critical. This layer, with its low friction, allowed for the potential release of an upward thinning snow slab. Thirdly, the hiker's act of cutting into the snow slope to create a flat platform for their tent inadvertently weakened the snow base and created a sheer wall of snow directly above them, making it susceptible to collapse. Wind-blown snow accumulation from katabatic or downslope winds caused a progressive accumulation of snow above the tent. This delayed the avalanche release, which according to the model occurred 7.5 to 13.5 hours after the tent was set up, consistent with the estimated time of death. Lastly, dynamic avalanche simulations demonstrated that even a relatively small slab of snow, impacting at approximately 2 meters per second, could cause severe but non-lethal thorax and skull injuries, corresponding to 28 to 34% thorax deformation if the victims were lying flat and pinned between the falling snow and the hard tent floor, which was reinforced by their skis. This unique scenario explains the car crash-like injuries without external wounds, which are not typically observed in avalanche victims, who usually die from suffocation. Despite these scientific advancements, arguments against the avalanche theory persist, and the evolution of the avalanche theory from initial dismissal to sophisticated scientific modeling demonstrates the power of interdisciplinary research in re-evaluating historical mysteries and providing plausible, if complex, natural explanations for seemingly inexplicable events. The progression shows that lack of evidence or inconsistent evidence in initial investigations does not necessarily mean a phenomenon did not occur, but rather that the understanding or investigative tools at the time were insufficient. Here are the key arguments against the avalanche theory and the counter-arguments from the more recent studies. Initial searchers reported no clear patterns of debris or displaced snow over a wide area, which is typical of an avalanche. However, subsequent snowfalls could have smoothed the slope and covered signs of a smaller, localized slab avalanche. The specific slab avalanche mechanism proposed does not necessarily involve a wide debris field. The campsite's slope was generally less than 30 degrees, averaging 23 degrees, which is typically considered the minimum angle for an avalanche to occur. Countering this, the local slope angle where the tent was cut was steeper, 28 to 30 degrees, and the buried weak layer was parallel to this steeper terrain, creating a localized instability. The avalanche, if it occurred, happened hours after the tent was pitched, not immediately. The Swiss model precisely explains this delay by the slow, progressive accumulation of wind-blown snow on the weakened snowpack, which eventually triggered the slab release. Experienced hikers like Dyatlov and Zolotaryov, a ski instructor, would not camp in an obvious avalanche path. Yet the specific combination of factors such as irregular topography, the tent cut, the weak snow layer, and strong winds created an unlikely avalanche scenario under natural conditions, making it difficult to predict even for seasoned experts. Footprints leading away from the tent were described as consistent with walking at a normal pace, not running in panic. While the initial flight from the tent might have been panicked, the subsequent movement could have been disoriented, but not necessarily a full sprint, especially in deep snow and extreme cold. Hypothermia itself can induce disorientation and a trance-like state. Also, skull and chest injuries were not typical for avalanche victims, who usually suffocate. The unique circumstance of the hikers being pinned against the hard tent floor by a slab avalanche explains the specific blunt force trauma, as opposed to being swept away in a typical avalanche. Despite the official conclusions and sophisticated scientific modeling, the Dyatlov Pass Incident continues to be a fertile ground for alternative theories, fueled by the initial Soviet secrecy and the sheer strangeness of the evidence. The sheer number and diversity of theories, especially the more outlandish ones, are a direct consequence of the initial Soviet secrecy and the official investigation's vague, compelling natural force conclusion. When official explanations are insufficient or perceived as untrustworthy, a vacuum is created which is inevitably filled by public speculation, conspiracy theories, and paranormal explanations. One of the most enduring theories posits military testing and a subsequent cover-up. Proponents cite several pieces of evidence, reports of glowing orbs or bright flying spheres in the sky by rescue teams and locals on the night of the incident and in the surrounding area. The traces of radiation found on some clothing, while now often explained by the Kishtim disaster, still raises suspicion for those who believe in military involvement. The car crash, like blunt force trauma, with no external wounds, is argued by some to be consistent with a blast or impact from an experimental weapon. A piece of metal found near the site was purportedly from a Soviet ballistic missile. Finally, the rapid closure and classification of the case by Soviet authorities, particularly in a period of supposed thaw, is seen as strong circumstantial evidence of a cover-up. Arguments against this theory include the lack of concrete evidence, such as blast craters, widespread debris, or other footprints beyond those of the hikers. Furthermore, if a test occurred, the question remains, why leave the bodies behind, and why stage such an elaborate scene? The infrasound-induced panic theory, popularized by American writer Donny Aicha, suggests that low-frequency sound waves, or infrasound, generated by wind passing over the mountains, perhaps through a Kármán vortex street phenomenon, could have caused nausea, dizziness, anxiety, and panic, driving the hikers to flee irrationally. This sudden, irrational flight from the tent without proper clothing is cited as supporting evidence. However, this theory struggles to explain the severe physical injuries sustained by some of the hikers. It is also unclear if the effects of infrasound would persist long enough to explain the subsequent deaths and actions of the group. Additionally, for the effect to be significant, the tent would have needed to be in a very specific downwind location, and the footprints were described as walking, not running in panic. A more outlandish theory, yet one that has gained traction among some enthusiasts, is the Yeti hypothesis, suggesting an attack by a Yeti or snowman. This theory draws on a cryptic note found in one hiker's diary. We now know that snowmen exist, as well as the severe injuries and the lack of external human footprints. However, there is a complete lack of credible physical evidence of a cryptid. The diary note is widely dismissed as a joke or a later fabrication. Furthermore, it is difficult to conceive how one creature could inflict such varied and severe injuries on 9 experienced hikers without leaving significant signs of struggle or definitive animal tracks. The missing soft tissues are more plausibly explained by post-mortem scavenging animals. Other speculations include mass hysteria. This theory suggests a psychological condition causing disorientation and irrational behavior in extreme cold. While paradoxical undressing aligns with this, it does not fully explain the severe injuries or the coordinated nature of some actions, such as attempting to make a fire. Nerve agents, contaminated water, or mushroom poisoning. These theories propose exposure to toxins, perhaps from military tests such as Novichok, which was reportedly tested near Kamadaban, another incident likened to Dyatlov Pass, or contaminated water from Lake Baikal, a known toxic waste dumping ground, or even hallucinogenic mushrooms. Arguments against these include a lack of direct forensic evidence for specific toxins and the public nature of the area, making secret nerve aging tests unlikely. An internal dispute or a romantic tiff. This theory suggests a violent argument among the group. However, there were no signs of internal struggle in the tent, and the nature of the injuries, crushing trauma, is inconsistent with typical interpersonal violence. And the footprints leading away from the tent were also described as orderly. Adding another layer to the mystery are the later revelations from Lev Ivanov, the chief investigator of the original case. In a 1990 article, Ivanov claimed his findings had been censored. He controversially stated that based on evidence gathered, the role of unidentified flying objects in this tragedy was quite clear. Ivanov speculated that a sphere might have exploded as the hikers ran, causing the severe injuries. He also mentioned finding unidentifiable cloth like a soldier's coat, glasses, and skis not belonging to the group. These later revelations, while intriguing, are often viewed with skepticism due to their timing, decades after the event, and lack of independent corroborating evidence. The paranormal elements often serve as placeholders for what cannot be explained by conventional science at the time of the incident or investigation. As scientific understanding evolves, some of these paranormal aspects can be recategorized. For example, scientific explanations now exist for paradoxical undressing, a symptom of hypothermia, and the missing organs post-mortem scavenging. The slab avalanche theory attempts to explain the severe injuries. The human mind seeks explanations for the unknown, and when conventional explanations are lacking or incomplete, the extraordinary fills the gap. As science progresses, some of these gaps shrink, but the cumulative strangeness of the Dyatlov Pass incident, the convergence of multiple unusual details, prevents a simple, universally accepted closure. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of history's most compelling and tragic unsolved mysteries. The primary theories attempting to explain the events of February 1st and 2nd, 1959, range from the scientifically robust, such as the slab avalanche hypothesis, which accounts for many of the anomalies including the tense state, the varied injuries and the subsequent hypothermia, to persistent speculative theories like military testing, infrasound-induced panic, and even extraterrestrial involvement. The official conclusion of a compelling natural force, while now bolstered by modern scientific modeling, still struggles to fully satisfy the public's desire for a definitive, unambiguous answer. The Dyatlov Pass incident serves as a stark reminder of humanity's vulnerability in the face of nature's unpredictable power, but also of the enduring human fascination with the unknown. The combination of an unexplained mass fatality, baffling forensic evidence, initial government secrecy, and the desolate, unforgiving landscape of the Ural Mountains has cemented its place in the annals of the unexplained. Perhaps the mountain will forever hold its secrets, leaving us to wonder about the precise sequence of terrifying events that unfolded on that fateful night. If you enjoyed this video, please take a moment to like it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the world's most enduring mysteries, and hit that bell icon so you're notified every time we unravel another perplexing enigma. Thank you for watching. Stay curious.